friends, and welcome to a new episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient. Cultural deconstruction runs rampant, and a looming nihilism seems to engulf all meaning and existence itself. Yet, the transcendence still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. As we embark on this exploration, we are reminded that the intersection of faith and science has long been a source of debate. Critics contend that the objective lens of psychology clashes with the subjective lens of religious belief, creating an ideological tension. Our conversation today aims to steer through this labyrinth of tensions, illuminating the potential synergies and indeed dependencies between Christianity and psychology. This conversation challenges such reductionist views, asserting the essential compatibility of these domains with a holistic worldview. So to guide us through this nuanced discussion, we're joined by an esteemed guest, Sean Brooks, psychologist, Latinist, and licensed marriage and family therapist, and an avid scholar of Christian theology. His insights, grounded in both scientific rigor and spiritual understanding, promise to shed light on the compatibility of these domains and the importance of embracing a holistic worldview. Welcome, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Jan. Good to be here today.
Good. I think I can go by Sean as well, right? I mean, we know each other long enough, so I'm going to skip.
I would imagine. Yeah.
Very good. So Sean, psychology and Christianity, maybe unbeknownst to some or even many, share a historical coexistence. And some argue that psychology emerged from a Christian perspective on humanity, combined with advancements in empirical science. So how do you see the relationship between psychology and Christianity evolving, and what insights can each field offer the other in your experience?
Yeah. So when I think about that question, I can't help but go back historically to the idea that in modernism, or when modernity came around, there was a split. That split has not always existed. That particularly even within medieval thought, there was this idea of theology being the principal, philosophy being the handmaiden or the right hand, and that everything kind of flowed through an understanding of who we are based on our relationship to God. If He is the creator, then that is the primary, that is the most central principle that kind of governs all exploration of the world. And that, not to oversimplify, but if we think about what science is doing, is that there are many different things that occur in our world that are amazing and astounding. And science is I think, natural God-given curiosity to figure out how does it do this? And why do these things do this? And that within Christianity, there's always been curiosity about, like, why does my heart do this? Why does my mind go this direction, right? And we think about Augustine, who did the first really kind of took the chance to let people into that inquiry and that self-exploration more than anybody had, at least up to that point, in terms of being that honest about asking those questions. So when we think about, or at least when I think about science, it's about understanding the intricacies and the order that is imbued in this creation that God has made. And it's a tool to gain better understanding. And so ultimately, there would be no reason why there would be any conflict between discovering how things work and then the ultimate end of all those things, which is what God has determined for them to be, the relationship with God. But again, and even though we've had our discussions about me being Protestant, I have to admit that the Protestant Reformation created so much tension in terms of discussing things from a theological view, that people wanted to create a safe, secular space that religion wouldn't muck up or confuse. And so tried to create a space where we could explore things without, any need for a particular religious or particular Christian conviction. We realized that actually just created another worldview. It didn't create an absence. You didn't create a neutral thing. And so unfortunately, you have this divorce. And so now instead of trying to figure out how things function and what makes them function that way, it came to be that science was now supposed to explain things without the need of God, which was not really what it is. Just a tool. It can't really even get you to that point. It can only tell you what is happening and what has previously happened, and you can test it, but you can't get to, if you will, a telos or a reason or a why. And so once you separate that, you kind of are left with a nihilistic or a no true end. It's just discovering for the sake of discovering, as opposed to how it could be valuable for my relationship with God, my relationship with others, my relationship with the world.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You're touching on many interesting subjects here. I think one of the great insights that you just repeated is this idea that in modernity, there is a stark shift away from looking at nature, observing nature, studying nature, learning from nature, onto controlling nature, right? Making it an object not just of understanding, but actually an object of our power, of changing it, of transforming it, and according to our will ultimately. So I always find that that's a very intriguing element of modernity. But I have a more specific question right now. You said that in the Middle Ages, theology was seen as the kind of the queen science, and then philosophy as the handmaiden, and that was the dominating worldview. And so psychologists, or at least psychology, even in its first stages, tried to create a safe space, and to use that word, that theology couldn't muck up. I find that really interesting. Now, my question is, many would say, though, that once theology or even Christianity enters, there is no more objective research possible because the end is already predetermined. So no matter how we're going to go about it, the end does always have to be the same, doesn't it?
When you say the end of what? Sorry, just to make sure I'm understanding the question.
The end of the research, like the end of what you can even discover in psychology. Isn't it already predetermined by Christian revelation?
Maybe you can help me understand. So, like, because of my convictions about what the ultimate end of reality is, because of how God has revealed himself, or what he says all of reality is moving towards, then any research would ultimately just come to that, or be would not have a point or a purpose, because that would it would collapse in that. I just making sure I understand that question. I mean, the idea would be, at least when I'm thinking about this, so a couple of things come to mind. So first of all, like, exploring the soul has been a part of Christianity always. Like, how could we make love the central focus of a belief system and not be curious as to how our heart does that, why our heart does that, what are the proclivities of, so we're already doing that. But when it came to understanding, like, the mechanisms in the body that contribute or are a part of that, by the time that becomes a direct focus, is already way into modernity. And so it's already well removed from the idea of understanding that in light of a relationship with the Creator, or in light of my religious responsibilities to neighbor and to the earth. So it's already, when we're thinking about psychology, and I think that's part of why maybe even some believers get a little anxious about it, is because it is a science when it became officially a science way after. And so what we would consider psychology wasn't being called psychology in the Middle Ages, right? It didn't really have its own area of expertise. And so when it did, it was already very distant from that point in time, right? very distant from that time. So by that time, it is very secular in terms of its goal to be to understand the mechanisms unencumbered by anything other than empirical science. But faith wouldn't limit what empirical science would give us. Empirical science would help us better understand the mechanism so that we can, if you will, love better. So if the ultimate end is that we love the Lord our God with our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love others as we love ourselves, then these bodies are where that happens. And these brains are like the fundamental contributor to that reality. And so understanding means that we can actually be even more skilled in the way that we love. So kind of that Thomistic understanding of love being the capacity and goal to seek what is best for the other and to seek unity with the other. For me to do that well, I need to understand you. I need to understand everything that makes yon yon. If I'm going to love you wisely, I need to understand. And so, like, I need to understand that if there's a certain chemical makeup in you, and that if I give you this particular food, it is going to harm you. Like, it's going to be not only that, but it's going to make it harder for you to love others. That's going to be helpful. And so a theological ultimate end wouldn't, in my mind, anyway, make purposeless or make futile empirical science. It would actually give empirical science a goal and trajectory that is full of meaning and has ultimate value and worth, because it is the means by which we understand how our mind, our bodies, our souls function, so that we can become far more skilled in doing what God has asked us to do, which is to love him and to love each other well.
That's really fascinating. That's amazing, because it implies that, well, following that original philosophical model, right, the know thyself, which is above the Oracle of Delphi, that path, that philosophical path of self-understanding, of searching for the self, but of self-understanding, actually ultimately then will enable us to become better Christians, better people, but also better Christians, right? And that kind of knowledge was already, well, you mentioned St. Augustine was already kind of maybe not implied, but it was already hidden in the writings. And I mean, Augustine would be great, obviously, with his Confessions, this really in-depth analysis of his memory and his sinfulness and his fallenness and the grace and how it works in him, right? So,
and him constantly asking the question in the Confessions of, why the heck am I doing this? Like, what is this in me? You know, and so he's not content with just, well, it's sin. Okay. All right. Like, just don't do it. And he's like, that didn't work for me. I couldn't just not do it. I need to better understand what is happening in me to understand how I can be more faithful. I need to understand what is making these different things so difficult for me, that understanding is only going to help. You know, at the end, right, the issue is not just a functional one, it is a spiritual one. And so there's only so far that just self-reflection can take us. But it is, if it is put under the ultimate goal of Christianity, which is to repair a relationship with our Creator, then it can be an incredibly helpful tool for understanding, again, how I go about being faithful in a meaningful way, and recognize the things that can hinder me from doing that.
Yeah. As a therapist, in your experience, are you encountering more people that are Christian and are doubtful of that psychology works, or are you encountering more people that are kind of secular and are doubtful about the truths of Christianity? Like, you have some experience?
I kind of experience both. Usually by the time they are sitting with me, they're at least willing and open to the psychology part, right? Because if they were completely against it, I mean, why are they talking to me?
Right.
And so there's probably still a skepticism, particularly if you have a more man, for some reason I can't even think of the term, a fundamentalist background within Christianity. There is a deep skepticism about psychology. There are people that I see that believe in psychology, but they aren't believers and wouldn't see why that would be an important factor to their healing. Because again, the secular idea is that essentially all the elements of your healing are within you.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of fundamentally, what you need is kind of fundamentally within you. It needs to be, depending on the model, it needs to be unlocked, it needs to be clarified, it needs to be healed, it needs to be released, whatever it may be. But fundamentally, there is nothing outside of me that I will ultimately need to accomplish healing. And so the idea of needing a savior to become emotionally healthy would just be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like,
Right.
I don't need an external reality. And so I kind of have, at least in my experience, kind of both. I've felt the tension of both, a skepticism in both directions.
That's fascinating. It's interesting. This would be the idea of the logos therapy, right, by Viktor Frankl as well in Man's Search for Meaning, where he, to my understanding, anyways, he appeals to that logos, that there's some kind of logical and rational power outside of me that somehow I need to come to terms with, for the kind of, well, for my healing to be complete. Right? Is that what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, well, there's kind of two aspects there. Is my fundamental understanding of what a human is and what human life is toward, the ultimate telos, is going to change the nature of what I even say health or flourishing is.
Hmm.
And so for me to say somebody has accomplished health, I have to define health. And health is going to be vastly different based upon what is my conviction about what is a natural, a correct human being. And so that's where worldview is just so impactful when it comes to what counseling is ultimate end. So if the end is just, for example, like I'm able to manage my emotional world better and get along in my relationships, so that I have less pain in my life,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that I'm going to have a different set of goals than if it is my ultimate goal is to be able to commune with my creator and seek unity and ultimate reconciliation with all image bearers. And that's a very different kind of picture of health, of what I'm going to need and what's going to happen into my soul for me to truly flourish, than just I need to avoid pain, or I just need to have less conflictual arguments, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does, of course. Yeah, it's. I mean, it's almost. It sounds to me like it's the productive seeking the good, on top of avoiding the evil in a sense, or avoiding a lack, avoiding a difficulty, but actually want to, one is one wants to go one step further in establishing that harmonious relationship. So very interesting. I had a question, and this came up in the previous conversation that we had, and I really found it fascinating. One tendency I think today, and this is, I guess, general to all medicine, not just to psychology, is this idea that, well, I go to the doctor, I feel ill some way or another. I go to the doctor, he prescribes me some pills. I'll pop the pills, and I'll feel better. And I do feel that, at least in some aspects, psychology suffers under that same kind of materialism, which, again, to me as a philosopher, it roots very much in this mechanistic understanding of the world, right? This Cartesian dualism, where the soul is everything that is the thinking, and the body is just this chemical, mechanistic, machine. Ultimately, it's a mechanical machine that follows the orders of the soul, but that is kind of this well-oiled mechanism. And if there is a cog missing this mechanism, or if there's not enough oil, well, we just add the oil, we just add the cog, and everything will run smoothly again. And I mean, even some transhumanists go very much in this direction. So my question to you is that, from like in your experience, but also from a psychological perspective, like, is that actually true? Like, is it possible to just take some medicine and resolve my psychological issues, generally speaking?
Yeah. This is something that I think even secular psychology is finally being more honest about, in terms of the fact that I think we have pushed the limits of what you can do from a mechanistic viewpoint. And even though that's what is articulated, it's not how it's approached. What I mean is that, like, for a while, we thought, about 20 years ago, that discovering the genome, understanding DNA, that, like, man, we now have the key that we could solve everything, right? From cancer to, like, marital quibbles. Like, if we can just understand where it's happening in the DNA, right? It's this mechanistic idea. And that was pushed and pushed and pushed. And at least within the realm of psychology, you're feeling this, like, well, the reality is you cannot separate experience from DNA, meaning that, like, there are even aspects of your DNA that won't present unless you have certain experiences that trigger them. So you can have things in your body or codes within your DNA that will remain dormant unless certain experiences or certain relationships take place. And so there's this understanding that your circumstances or environment, it is just as important, is we're moving in that way. And again, as a believer, what I'm saying is that because we're designed by a triune God who is a relationship, even though he is one, we are designed to be relational. And so ultimately, it can't just be with what's in us to be fixed. It's going to also have to be the relationships that I have. That me being fully me is going to require you being fully you, and us participating like that. That's what the end is. And so mechanistic ends can at best relieve or help eliminate physical barriers, right? That hinder that. But at the end of the day, again, if we're just a mechanism, and ultimate end of man is just to remove pain until you die because there is no meaning on the other end, well, then let's just give everybody morphine. Like, what are we doing? But the whole point is that we want to remove pain. So why? They can live their lives. And why is it so important to live their lives? It's because of the connections and the relationships that occur. Those are the things that, even if we don't want to, like, those are the things that mean things to us. And so all that to say is that just fixing the body won't ultimately fix what we're needed to fully flourish, to fully be human. It just won't get to that. And I think even psychology is recognizing that, is you can help correct a hormone, but you can't actually create, like, a neural pathway. Only experience can create a neural pathway. So it doesn't matter what happens in my DNA. It doesn't matter if I have all the mechanisms within my brain for a functioning eye. If a child does not see light for the first 5 years of their life, even though they have all the correct DNA, if they don't have the experience of light, their body will eventually no longer, because it won't create those connections, it will make it so that connection is just no longer a possibility for them, if that makes any sense. And so,
yeah. Go ahead.
And so in that way, just the building blocks aren't enough to say what a human being is. That by our very nature, how we relate in our relationships with one another actually form our brains and form our experience. And so that's where, there's no amount of mere mechanistic interventions that will ultimately lead to healing and flourishing.
That's that's really powerful. Now you obviously have a lot of experience with couple therapy and with marriage therapy. Um, has the experience of applying this been successful? Like, have you had an overwhelming experience of couples actually working out their problems based on this relational approach that you have? And I'm sure that you're not the only one that has this, but does it actually work? That's my question.
It's a loaded question. Absolutely. But in all experiments,
It's got to obviously predetermine your future clients. So now you got to care.
100% money back guarantee. Well, the problem is that so relationships are what cause the greatest damage, and relationships are the means of the greatest healing. And so the challenge is that that therapy is not an experiment that is not also in the experiment. What I mean is therapy is also a relationship. You are doing the thing that you are trying to heal, if that makes sense, even in that context. And so there is a limitation for what the relationship can accomplish based on the willingness and the capacity of the individuals in that situation. And so the variables are just high in terms of that regard. And I'm trying to let myself off the hook. Like, if I do my job well, then it should lead in that direction. But there's also the reality that that if one member is not completely sold and resists, then there's only so far we can go.
Well, the
that willingness.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a difference between being truly open to something and being skeptical. The way I kind of think about it, and whether this analogy is helpful or not, like if you're going to jump off a high dive, right, and you're trying to land in a way that's safe, the more tense you are, the more likely you're going to belly flop, because you need the freedom of motion. You need the looseness to be able to kind of control your body in a meaningful way. And so all that to say is that doesn't excuse hopefully the skill of the therapist to create a safe space that hopefully could help somebody relax. But if there is a tension and there's a resistance, then some of the moves that you're asking them to move, they're going to belly flop. Right? The tightness is going to be, they're going to kind of try it and kind of not try it. And when you go halfway, you end up like wiping out. And so, yes, I would say it's incredibly effective. I have seen it incredibly valuable because I have resources from my Christian belief that ultimately aren't available in a secular world. At the end of the day, if a marriage isn't making you happy, why work on it? If at the end, nothing happens at the end of this world, like, why are we going through this headache? Why would we do this work? Why would you try to change ways that, patterns of relating that you've had your entire life to make a marriage better? Why not just find a different one? If it's just, be as happy as you can and then you die. Like, but if the resources are different, where it's like, there is a way that through marriage, you can change some of the ways that you've done things, because if it's hurting your marriage, it hurts all the relationships you have. And that when God allows you to be a part of a marriage, it creates a very intense test case for all of the relational challenges that you have, and it puts them all in one place. And so if there's an ultimate goal that no matter what, even if this marriage is difficult, it can be giving you benefit and ultimately be worth the advantage, not just for closeness with that spouse, but it also change how you experience God and others. Like that's a way different resource than, well, you could feel a little bit better if you try really hard for a while. No, after you. No, after you.
Well, it is fascinating because the what you mentioned is this kind of trying to hold back, right? So in your analogy, keeping the body stiff for whatever reason it may be, but that is precisely that which also allows you, sorry, which hinders you in loving more, right? Because love is always this vulnerability, and I mean, many spiritual writers have said this. Also, many psychologists have said this, that you need to make yourself vulnerable in a certain sense, and only in that vulnerability can you be relational, can you really build up relation, because otherwise that the self-defense mechanisms that you build up in order to protect the whatever is hurt, right, whatever the wound is, will at the same time also push out, a friend or a spouse or a child even that you want to have a relation with. But it's very striking to think about it that way. But I mean, what's even more striking is to really think about, like, why doing it? And I feel that in modernity, that's really the point, because there is no more final end, because there's no more creator, because there's no more image character, because there's no more relational God. That has been kind of the conclusion. The conclusion has been, why try? Let's not. It seems to make it easier, right? But I think that's kind of the illusion, right? That's kind of the lie, ultimately, that making it easier for oneself, but it will actually lead into unhappiness. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, again, we come back to how do we define, happiness, and thinking more in terms of the Greek understanding of happiness, which is completeness or perfection. Like what truly is human happiness? Well, again, if you don't understand what humans are, this is where we go back to Aristotle. If you don't understand what human beings are for, and so then you are going to limit how happy they can be. And so if humans are designed to be a self, to be a very firm and complete self, but also to selflessly love, and that you need both, that if you remove one or the other, you can't have that full, complete human experience. And so going for just my happiness, you're right, works actually against my ultimate happiness. But again, without an ultimate goal or understanding of why humans exist and to what end is the gift of being for a human, then you don't have that clear goal. And then you feel this tension in modernity of chasing after things for a little while, getting bored with that because it doesn't deliver, and then chasing after something else. And that's where you find philosophers, and in James K. Smith's book On the Road with Augustine, he talks about at some point you convince yourself that the road is the destination, that this chasing after is the thing that we're supposed to be, as opposed to the idea that there is actually something that I am chasing after, that there is a home for me to get to. Because I can't find it here, I convince myself that the looking is the whole point.
Yep. So it's very. I'm very happy that I'm not the only one that cites books in these interviews. So I'm glad that also you give us some homework. Now, there's one thing that, from a philosophical perspective, I like to kind of zoom in, if you allow me, which is really the question of the soul. And since Plato, that has been a pivotal, well, essential element of any philosophizing, right? This idea of the existence of the soul, of the immortality of the soul, but also then of the forming of the soul, right? Because what is wisdom for if not allowing a soul, allowing a human being to live a better life? So from a more scientific, less philosophical, but more scientific point of view, I mean, would you say that the existence of the soul is a matter of fact?
Uh, Depends
Difficult
on
one.
how I want to say that. It is to me, it bears all the weight of a fact. Like it's an inescapable reality. The challenge, though, is certainty in the sense of like scientific provable. Its ability to be proved, and so I think, like God, it's not something that you can prove through science because it extends beyond what science is looking at. What I mean is science is looking at the material world and how that functions and what's repeatable and all of those things. And I think that's why when we look at full knowledge, we look at full knowledge of ultimately trying to think of things the way that God sees them as best as we can, think God's thoughts after him, then you can't really get to prove the soul without access to philosophy and theology and human experience and sociology, because the overwhelming weight of the evidence for the human soul is everything that makes a human, all the different aspects of knowledge. And so, but if I break it down and thinking about it almost merely scientifically, that there is some sort of organizing principle that makes human beings that isn't just DNA. It's not. I mean, maybe we will find it again. Who knows? Maybe the science just hasn't gotten to it yet. But we know that you and I can have the same DNA, and you and I have two slightly different I mean, even if we grew up in the same house and we have, twins and have the same DNA, we end up being different people. That there is something beyond, there's some sort of organizing principle that makes a human being that DNA just can't explain, or the mere physical aspect of a human being can't explain. And again, for me, as a believer, that's where I step out of sciences that can't answer that, and I go to the fact that you were created in the image of God. That the central reality, the form of a human being, is as a relational being, just like the creator that made you.
Yeah. We had a German historian of science in this interview series before, and he has written well over 40 books on the physicists of the early 20th century, Einstein, Heisenberg, the whole lot. And he himself came to the conclusion, as many of them did, which is the path of empirical science, of the science that studies matter, actually ends up in exactly the same place than philosophy and psychology and the non-empirical sciences, which is a place of wonder, where at the end you think that you've explained the atom, but then you realize, well, but the atom still can be split up. And so what's there then? Well, there's all of these particles, right, revolving in relationship towards one another. And what's the base of that? Well, it's energy. Well, what is energy, right? Energy is love, right? It could be love. It could be relationality. You have many words expressing it or describing it. But ultimately, even before the atom, and as he argued, we stand and we say, we don't know how it works. We can just describe it. And so we stand there in wonder. And for him, that was a strong argument to actually embark on the scientific investigation, because it's a never-ending opening of the world, a deepening of the world, a deepening of the mystery of the world. And I think this is what all kinds of scientists have to learn, is that they just have to go a little bit deeper, right? Max Planck said that, right? I think if I said this correctly, that a little sip of science it makes you an atheist, but then when you empty the cup, on the bottom of the cup, you find God. And this is kind of the problem, is that scientists, they stop too early, right? They don't go deeper. They don't go to the next layer. And if they were, then there would be a much greater synergy as well between the different sciences. And maybe, again, that unity that we have seemingly lost in modernity after the Middle Ages. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, again, because I think as a therapist, there's always a fundamental reason why we don't go deeper. That exploration comes from a place of safety, not from a place of desperation. And so the safer I feel in the reality that there will always be home, right? That there really is an ultimate home for humanity, then there's no risk in going deeper and going deeper and going deeper, because there's always going to be home, right? At the end, I'm always going to find God waiting for me with his arms open. Like, it just doesn't, whether it's stars, no matter how deep. However, if there is a dreadful, if I've had experiences that make it so, for example, that authority figures have taken advantage and hurt me, and the idea of at some point submitting to something outside of myself is such a terrifying idea, then even in my science, I'm going to be limited, because at some point, if I'm pushed up against, do I put myself in the incredible vulnerable position of accepting some authority outside of me for what makes this world and potentially put myself in a place of danger? Or am I going to double down on the explanation that I have thus far that does explain things in a meaningful way? It has a limiter in terms of how much farther I can go. And so again, I'm always thinking, well, yeah, if we go deep enough, this world is amazing. And the more you discover things, and again, to me, it's like, this, an old school argument, but not even an argument, but more like an emotional experience, is like when you look at a watch, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. How do you do it? This is so fascinating how this thing can happen. And so my soul is at a point where I cannot help but think of a watchmaker, right? That's just my conviction and where we are. And so I'm just saying that in my understanding, fundamentally, the reason why we don't accept God is not an intellectual one. It's an emotional one. There's something at stake if I were to say that this cosmic person is in charge. There's a lot at stake. There's a lot of vulnerability there. And my conviction is because the reality is like we're saying, you can't prove God, you can't disprove God, right? I would say the overwhelming evidence for me, but that's different than a proof, right? And so in that space, in that space, it's not going to be there's an intellectual hangup that is prohibiting me. It's usually, or I would even go as far as to say, it's ultimately going to be a psychological reason why going any farther is too dangerous for me, and I'm not willing to do that.
Yeah. No, what a beautiful thought, that you need the home in order to explore, and then exploration is really fun, right? So now we started with a straight up theoretical stuff. I should have probably started with something much more personal. Maybe we can end on that note. For the viewers and the audience who are interested in this kind of psychology that you're doing, can you just give us a little bit of a background, like where you're coming from? So what kind of teacher you had that maybe led you in this way? Was it completely like a self-discovery moment? Or is this kind of Christianity, psychology, unity, is that somewhere to be found in our days?
Yeah. So my personal story is when we were about 5-6 years into marriage, it was about to explode, and it just wasn't working. And at the time, not out of freedom, but out of deep religious conviction, I had to make the marriage work, and so out of desperation, we went to several different counselors, and then we landed on a counselor that became essentially a counselor and a mentor for me, whose name is Rich Plass. And he explained things in ways that I had just never heard. And we don't need to get into that deep world of biblical counseling versus Christian psychology versus levels of explanation or integration, that whole thing. But I had been in the camp of biblical counselors, and so there was never any talk about the brain or any talk about instinct, any of that kind of stuff, or family of origin or any of that. And so Rich spoke to us in a way that, oh my gosh, like so many pieces were making sense and so many different things were, oh my goodness, like all those experiences that once they say it, they're like, how did I not see it that way? It's just so obvious that it was that way. And so I asked him where he learned, and he actually pointed me back. So I had left seminary and I went back at the time. A guy who became my mentor as well, Eric Johnson, he was teaching at Southern Seminary. So I went back to the seminary and studied under him, took every class that he had. And he is the one that really, for me, is championing, at least in America, that idea of a truly Christian psychology. And so he's the teacher that challenged me with these things, and we continue to have conversations. His two books, I think, are the most helpful for understanding this entire conversation. And so it's not going to give you like a Christian modality or like a Christian way to do CBT, but it's more like a meta understanding of a philosophical world overview that influences how you could do Christian psychology. So, foundations of soul care, sorry, and then God and Soul Care are his two books that were the most formative for me in terms of thinking about Christian psychology.
Very nice. Well, I'm glad that you embarked on that journey, and then now you're sharing it with all of your patients and all of the couples that are around you, and also your friends. So, Sean, thank you very much for being on this interview today with me, and I hope that we'll continue this conversation off camera, but also maybe another time on camera. I wish you all the best, and I'll see you next time.